Under the blistering noon sun, the station lay bare as bone. Its timbers cracked from heat, its benches grayed by dust, its signs swaying faintly in the dry wind. The train had come and gone, the whistle long faded into silence, leaving behind only the rattle of cicadas and a single figure seated at the far end of the platform. She held her suitcase tight against her belly, though there was nothing inside worth guarding except a faded dress, a worn Bible, and a letter already wrinkled from too much unfolding. For 3 days Erin had sat there. She was 27 and carried more weight than the world thought she deserved. Each glance cast her way carried the same unspoken judgment, that she was too much, too wide, too slow for the promises the West demanded. The townsfolk passed by, carrying parcels and gossip, never failing to let their eyes linger longer than kindness would allow. Some smirked. Some whispered. Children pointed, mothers tugged them along, and still she kept waiting. The first day, she told herself he had been delayed. Trains were late often, the rails were as unpredictable as the weather. She kept her chin high, the letter clutched, lips moving with the words written in a careful hand, words that promised marriage, a home, perhaps even respect. By evening, when the lamplighter struck the first flame along the street, she still believed he would arrive. The second day stripped her of belief. Hunger gnawed. She had not eaten since a shopkeeper's wife gave her a small roll, half pity and half charity. Sleep had been a fitful affair on the hard bench, with the stars too bright and the night too cold. She rose stiff, brushed dust from her skirt, and resumed her vigil, but her shoulders sagged. Her hope, once full as a river, now trickled dry. By the third morning, whispers had grown cruel. A pair of young cowhands walked by, loud enough for her to hear, reckoned the groom took one look at her in that photograph and ran for the hills. The laughter that followed was like a whip across her back. She pressed the letter against her chest until the paper nearly tore. But she did not cry then. Not yet. Pride was the last thing she owned, and she would not surrender it to strangers. Across the platform, leaning against the post of the telegraph office, a man watched her in silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing eyes that seemed carved from the same stern landscape that surrounded them. Roger had lived 31 years, long enough to know the weight of silence, longer still to accept it as a companion. He had lost more than he spoke of: family, warmth, the simple ease of laughter, and the prairie had hardened him into a man who seldom gave more than a nod. Yet for 3 days he had watched this woman sit alone, shrinking further into herself while the world mocked. Something in her stillness pulled at him, though he said nothing. When evening rolled in and the third train screamed past without slowing, Erin rose. The letter slipped from her hand and drifted onto the platform boards. She bent slowly to retrieve it, fingers trembling. Her lips moved, almost prayerful, as she whispered words meant for no one. Maybe I came to the wrong platform. It was not loud, but Roger heard it. The way her voice cracked, weary and small, struck deeper than the mocking of townsfolk ever could. He shifted against the post, as though his body wanted to move toward her, but his boots rooted him fast. Erin pressed the letter back into her suitcase and straightened her shoulders. Dusk spread across the land, bleeding purple into gold. The last of the shopkeeper's shuttered windows. Children were called in for supper. Soon only she remained, her figure outlined against the setting sun, heavy yet fragile, like a statue no one wanted but none dared topple. She had waited 3 days for a man who would not come. Now hunger and shame pressed against her ribs until she could hardly breathe. She clutched the handle of her case and stepped down from the platform. The wooden boards creaked as though mourning her departure. Her boots struck dust, and she began to walk with no direction in mind, only away from the station that had given her nothing but emptiness. Roger's gaze followed. He did not speak, though words burned at the back of his throat. His horse shifted nearby, sensing the tension in him. He clenched his hands, fighting the urge to call out. He had chosen silence over love long ago, believing the West too cruel to allow such softness, and yet as she disappeared down the road, he felt the quiet he had clung to for years cracking like thin ice. Erin walked into the deepening twilight, the suitcase dragging her arm low. Her breath came hard. Hunger hollowed her, But it was not hunger that bent her shoulders, it was the weight of being unwanted, of realizing she had no one waiting, nowhere to go. She passed the last lanterns of town and stepped into open prairie, the wind colder now, coyotes already calling in the distance. Behind her, the station fell into darkness. Ahead of her, nothing promised light. She stopped once, looking back, but no one stood at the edge of the platform to follow. Her eyes burned, and at last the tears came, hot and unrelenting, falling onto the dust at her feet. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking, and whispered to the night that she had been foolish to believe love could be waiting. When she dropped her hands, the horizon yawned wide before her. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a faint glow flickered, a single cabin light holding steady against the dark. She took one breath, then another, and though her body resisted, her feet began to move toward it, as though some invisible thread had drawn her across the endless plain. At the telegraph office, Roger still stood, hat in hand, staring after her vanishing form. He did not know what he would do when the sun rose again. He only knew that the silence he had chosen all these years felt heavier now, and for the first time in a long while, he was afraid of what it might cost him. The night wind rose, carrying her whispered words back across the empty tracks. Maybe I came to the wrong platform. They lingered in his ears long after she was gone, haunting as a vow unkept, and in that sound was the beginning of something neither of them yet dared name. The prairie night closed in fast, swallowing the road with shadows. Erin walked with the suitcase dragging at her arm, every step heavier than the last. Hunger gnawed deep, but it was loneliness that truly bit, loneliness sharper than any wolf's tooth. The horizon stretched wide and merciless, yet a faint light flickered in the distance, stubborn against the dark. She fixed her eyes on it as if it were a star fallen to earth, the last proof that warmth might still exist in a world that had turned its back on her. The closer she drew, the more it steadied, glowing through cottonwoods bent by the wind. Her boots scuffed the dirt, her dress catching burrs, her body aching from days without rest. When at last she reached the cabin, she stood still, hand pressed against the rough wood of the doorframe. Her courage trembled. To knock was to beg, and she had sworn never to beg again, but the cold pressed in and the light was too much temptation. She raised her fist, struck the door once, twice, then let it fall. Inside, Roger stirred. He had not expected visitors. His nights were carved from solitude. Yet when he opened the door, the lantern light fell upon her face, pale, tired, streaked with tears not yet dried. For a moment he simply looked, and she dropped her eyes, unable to endure the weight of being seen. "Only one night's shelter, sir," she murmured, her voice thin as thread. "I'll leave by morning." The words carried both plea and promise. She braced herself for rejection, for the door to close, for the look she had known too often, that glance which measured her body before discarding her worth. Roger did not move. Silence stretched, thick as storm clouds. She shifted, ready to turn away, when at last he stepped back and opened the door wider. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and stew, faint yet rich to her empty stomach. A single lantern burned on the table, throwing long shadows along the walls. He gestured, nothing more, and she stepped inside with her suitcase clutched tight. The warmth struck her first, then the stillness, the kind of stillness that felt like listening. He set a bowl before her without words, thick with beans and meat, steam curling upward. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. She tried to eat slowly, but hunger betrayed her. She swallowed too fast, nearly choking, tears stinging her eyes as she whispered thank you. Roger said nothing. He simply watched, his face unreadable yet not unkind. When she finished, she set the bowl down gently, as if afraid to seem greedy. "I can sleep outside," she said, her voice faltering. "The porch will do." Again came his silence, but this time it was different, weighted, thoughtful. He moved to the hearth, tossed in another log, and spoke at last, his voice low, deep, rough from disuse. "Stay." One word, but it startled her more than if he had shouted. She looked at him, unsure she had heard right. He did not repeat himself, only pointed toward the pallet near the fire. Her breath caught. Gratitude swelled in her chest so sharp it hurt. She laid her suitcase beside the hearth and sank down, the blanket he had placed folded at her side. The fire's glow brushed her cheeks, softening the lines of weariness. For the first time in days, she felt more than tolerated, she felt permitted to exist. Roger sat across from her, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. He had offered shelter to many strays before, starving animals, broken horses, but not to a woman. He had long ago sealed himself against such entanglements, believing solitude easier than disappointment. Yet here she was, filling his cabin with the sound of her breath, with a presence that shifted the air. They did not speak much. Words seemed unnecessary, even dangerous, as if breaking the silence would shatter whatever fragile accord had been granted. But when she pulled the blanket over her shoulders and laid down, she whispered softly, as if confessing to the fire rather than to him, "I thought he would come. The letter promised. 3 days I waited. 3 days. Roger did not answer. He had no words to mend betrayal, no sermon to soothe wounds. Yet her voice lodged in him, stirring an ache he had buried beneath years of hard earth. He watched her eyelids flutter closed, exhaustion dragging her into sleep, and for the first time in years he found himself unwilling to return to silence. Outside, the prairie howled with coyotes. The wind rattled the shutters, but the cabin stood firm. Within its walls, 2 lives that had circled emptiness now shared a fragile center. Aaron's breathing steadied, soft and deep, while Roger sat long into the night, staring at her sleeping form as though it were the first proof he had ever seen that brokenness could still be beautiful. When the fire burned low, he rose and draped another blanket over her. His hand lingered a moment near her shoulder, not daring to touch, yet unable to draw away quickly. The sight of her curled there, safe for once, carved something inside him he could not name. He returned to his chair, yet sleep would not come. Instead he listened, to the crackle of embers, to her breathing, to the faint echo of her whispered confession. He thought of the station where she had waited, alone beneath the eyes of strangers. He thought of her voice breaking when she said, "Maybe I came to the wrong platform." The memory cut through him with strange urgency, as though her words had been meant not for the absent man, but for him. Dawn would come soon, and with it choices either of them yet knew how to face. But for now, the night held them in its fragile grasp, the orphan woman who had begged for one night, and the Kalba who had given her more than he meant to. Erin stirred in her sleep, lips parting as though to speak. Her hands slipped from the blanket, fingers curling toward the firelight. Roger's eyes followed the movement, caught between reaching out and holding still. He clenched his fists in his lap, the silence pressing hard against him. For years he had believed quiet was safety, that love was a luxury carved out of softer lands. But as the first pale streaks of dawn bled through the shutters, he realized his silence was no longer safe. It was a prison, and this woman, asleep by his fire, had just placed the key in his hands. The wind hushed. The coyotes fell silent. A fragile calm hung in the cabin, broken only by the sound of her breath and the unspoken truce stirring between them. And when Erin opened her eyes at dawn, she would find him watching, caught in the moment between silence and something he could no longer hold back. The days that followed stretched quiet and strange, as though time itself had slowed to study the fragile arrangement inside Roger's cabin. Erin did not leave in the morning as she had promised. Instead she lingered, her suitcase by the hearth, her eyes avoiding his but her hands finding small tasks. She swept the floor without being asked, mended a torn sleeve of his shirt, tended the kettle until the stew thickened just right. Each act was small, but each stitched her presence deeper into the cabin's silence. Roger let her stay without question. He spoke little, though more than before, short words, measured and steady. He told her where the flour was kept, where the well stood, which fence posts leaned hardest in the wind. She listened as though every word mattered. And in the spaces between their sentences, something unsaid began to grow, fragile but undeniable. But the world beyond the cottonwoods noticed. When Roger rode into town for supplies, the whispers began. Men leaned on fence rails, smirking, asking if he'd taken in the fat woman who'd been left stranded at the station. They laughed like coyotes, gnashing their teeth at what they thought a joke. Women lowered their voices but sharpened their tongues, calling her shameless, saying no self-respecting man would take her in unless desperation blinded him. Roger heard it all and answered none of it. His silence was not weakness but defiance, a wall they could not scale. Yet when he returned home, dust on his boots and anger in his chest, Erin saw it in his eyes. She set bread before him and asked nothing, but the way her hands trembled as she poured water spoke her fear. That night she broke. She sat before the fire, her hair unpinned, her eyes shadowed by more than weariness. "I was promised," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Promised marriage by a man who never came. I thought if I crossed the miles, if I waited long enough, I'd be worth keeping. But he never meant it. Maybe no one ever will." Roger did not move. The flames painted his face in flickering gold, his jaw tight, his silence holding steady. She looked at him, waiting for disgust, for dismissal, for the cabin door to open and close behind her. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low, rough as gravel yet certain. "You are here now. That is enough." The words struck her harder than cruelty ever had. Her chest heaved, tears spilling before she could stop them. No man had ever spoken so plain, so unadorned, and yet so full of truth. She covered her face, but he reached out, slow, hesitant, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. It was the barest touch, but it burned with gentleness she had thought the world incapable of. From that night something shifted. Erin rose earlier, worked harder, laughed once by accident when a hen pecked at her hem. Roger heard the sound and turned quickly, as though afraid it would vanish. She carried the memory of his words like a hidden ember, warming places in her heart long frozen. Yet the West did not forgive. At the blacksmith's one morning, Roger found two men jeering, saying he'd traded pride for pity, that a man of his standing could have chosen prettier, slimmer, younger. Roger met their laughter with calm eyes, saying only, "She is the prettiest woman I've ever known." His voice carried no heat, no boast, only truth. The laughter faltered, though the mockery lingered in their smirks. News traveled fast. By sundown, Erin heard whispers even in town. Children snickered, women shook their heads. She felt their eyes like thorns against her skin. She wanted to shrink back into the cabin, vanish into silence, but Roger stood beside her at the mercantile, steady as a mountain. When she faltered, his hand brushed hers, unseen, a small tether holding her upright. That evening, as the prairie darkened and the lantern burned low, Erin spoke the rest of her truth. She confessed she had worked once in hardship no woman should endure, labor taken not by choice but by survival. Men had judged her for her body, for her hunger, for her need, and she had carried the shame like a stone in her chest. She braced herself now for him to turn away, to see her as the rest of the world did. But Roger's gaze did not waver. He listened, his silence deeper than judgment, his eyes steady. When she finished, trembling, he said only, "You've carried enough weight alone. Let me carry some." Her breath broke. She had expected rejection, but found something else, a quiet acceptance that undid her. She turned away, covering her mouth, as though the sobs rising from her chest might shame her further. But Roger stepped closer, his presence a shield, his silence a kind of vow. The days that followed carried both cruelty and courage. The town's whispers grew sharper, but within the cottonwoods the cabin grew warm. Erin found herself humming softly while she worked. Roger, once a man of stone, began to linger near her voice, his silences no longer empty but filled with listening. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky, Erin stood outside the cabin, her hands deep in flour. Roger joined her, wiping dust from his palms, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The world will not stop mocking," she said quietly, not daring to look at him. "Let them," he answered. "They don't know what I know." She turned then, searching his face. "What do you know?" His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "That you are braver than any of them." The words sank deep, deeper than she dared let him see. She looked away, afraid her face would betray her heart. Yet inside her, a truth grew, fragile, terrifying, but alive. When night fell, she lay awake by the fire, listening to his breathing from the chair across the room. She thought of the station, of 3 days of waiting, of the letter that had crumbled her hope. She thought of the cruel laughter that had followed her every step. And she thought of him, the man who had spoken only a handful of words, yet each had been heavy with a weight she could trust. Her secret had not driven him away. Instead, it had bound him closer. Still, fear lingered. She knew the West could break even the strongest hearts. As she drifted into restless sleep, she wondered whether his silence would hold when the world pressed harder, when her weight, of body, of past, of shame, grew too heavy even for him. The fire cracked low, shadows dancing on the walls. Roger sat long into the night, watching her sleep, the words unspoken heavy in his chest. He knew what he had seen at the station, what he had felt since. But to speak it aloud would change everything, and he was not yet ready to name the truth rising in him. And so the night stretched on, filled with silence, filled with possibility, and filled with the unspoken question of whether love could stand against the whole West. The storm passed in the night, but its memory lingered in the hush that fell over the cabin. When morning broke, the mountains were sheathed in snow that glistened like a promise, fragile yet absolute. Smoke curled from the chimney, its lazy trail the only sign of life against the whiteness, and inside, warmth bloomed slowly, fed by the rhythm of crackling logs. She woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment she thought it a dream, those long-forgotten mornings when her husband had still been alive, when her daughters had laughed at the table, and life had not yet pressed her into silence. But it was not memory. It was now. She stirred beneath the quilt, listening. The man moved carefully about the kitchen, his boots left near the door so he padded in woolen socks. His hands, broad and scarred, managed small tasks with surprising patience, pouring water, stirring a pot, tending to what little food he had. He did not hum, but she could hear the sound of him breathing steady, as if the weight of her presence no longer unsettled him. Her daughters were still curled beside her, the smaller one's hair tangled across her arm. Their breath rose and fell in fragile unison, and she kissed their foreheads before slipping free. The boards creaked, betraying her, but he did not turn. Instead, he spoke low. "There's biscuits. Not much, but warm." His voice, gravel at the edges, carried no demand, only a simple offering. She stepped into the glow of the stove, hesitant, as though she were entering holy ground. Her bare feet chilled against the floor, her nightdress thin. He noticed, for he reached for the woolen blanket draped over a chair and handed it without a word. She took it, her eyes not quite meeting his. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, and it was enough. They ate quietly, the biscuits crumbling soft, the coffee bitter but good. The girls roused at the smell, their faces brightening when they saw the spread. He poured them each a cup of warm milk, careful not to fill it too high lest little fingers spill. Watching him, she felt something stir she had thought long dead, an ache, tender and unguarded. After breakfast, he pulled on his boots and coat. "I'll check the barn," he said. "See if the stock survived the night." She nodded, though she had no claim to his animals, no place in his keeping. Yet when he stepped out into the blinding snow, she felt the emptiness of the room deepen without him. Her daughters played at the hearth, stacking blocks he had carved from scrap wood. She watched them laugh, watched their small hands build crooked towers, and thought how swiftly despair had turned into safety within these rough-hewn walls. A cabin that had been nothing to her days ago now felt like the last stronghold in a hostile world. He returned with snow on his hat and shoulders, stamping his boots before entering. "Barn's holding. Lost a hen, maybe two. The mule's still standing." His tone was matter-of-fact, but she heard relief beneath it. The day passed in work. He split wood while she mended a torn shirt. The girls gathered twigs and fed the fire like keepers of some sacred flame. Time, once cruel, slowed into rhythm. When dusk came, the horizon blazed gold against the snow, and the cabin filled with a quiet that was not loneliness, but belonging. By lamplight, she told her daughters a story, an old tale of a bird that sang spring into being. Her voice trembled at first, for it had been long since she had spoken more than necessity. But the girls leaned close, their eyes wide, and soon her words grew stronger, weaving warmth into the room. The man listened too, though he sat apart at the table, whittling. She pretended not to notice, but when her voice faltered on the ending, he supplied it softly, as if he had known the tale all along. Her heart beat strangely at that, two voices carrying one story, like threads woven on the same loom. Night deepened. Snow fell again, fine and unrelenting. She tucked her daughters into the bed, kissed their curls, and lingered a moment, watching their lashes rest against their cheeks. Then she crossed to the table where he still sat, carving shavings that curled like ribbon. "You've given us more than we deserve," she said, her voice low. He shook his head. "No one deserves the cold. But shelter, food, your kindness. You could have turned us away." He looked at her then, his eyes shadowed in lamplight. "I know what it is to be turned away." The words silenced her. She wanted to ask, who had turned him out, what wound had carved the lines across his face, but something held her tongue. Perhaps the knowing that everyone carried ghosts, and some were better left to rise in their own time. Instead, she said, "I don't know how long we can stay." "As long as you need," he answered, almost too quickly, and she saw the truth of it in his gaze. Silence settled between them, not empty but heavy with things unspoken. She rose then, retreating toward the bed, though her steps faltered at the threshold. She turned once more, caught by the sight of him, the solitary figure bent over the table, lamplight crowning his bowed head, as if the cabin itself had chosen him for its guardian. She lay awake long after, listening to the wind claw at the walls, to the faint scrape of his knife, to the silence that grew when he finally set it down. Her daughters slept peacefully, safe at last, and though her body longed for rest, her mind wandered. She thought of how easily a shelter became a home, how quickly a stranger's fire became the heart of one's survival. And she wondered if the danger outside, the snow, the hunger, the world that had no mercy, was not easier to face than the stirring within her chest. When sleep finally claimed her, it was with an image she could not shake, not of her daughter's smiles, nor of the storm's ruin, but of his hand passing her the blanket that morning, rough and steady, as though it belonged there. The wind howled again in the small hours, rattling the windows, but another sound pierced through, the sharp creak of the front door easing open. She woke, her heart hammering, certain the storm had found its way inside. But when she looked, she saw the lamplight flicker and his figure slip out into the snow, silent as shadow. He had taken his rifle with him. The night before the trial, the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls as though the whole prairie meant to lean in and listen. Inside, lantern light swayed across faces carved by worry and exhaustion. Clara sat near the table, hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug that had long since gone cold. Her eyes found Daniel, who was sharpening his knife not because he needed to but because his hands couldn't rest. Every scrape of metal against stones sang of the danger ahead. "They'll make an example of you," Clara whispered. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady by the end. "They want to see you bend, Daniel. Not just you, the idea of men like you who take in the loss when the town would rather turn away." Daniel set the knife down. His gaze moved over to her daughters, asleep together in the corner, their little bodies curled like kittens beneath a single quilt. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his words came low and sure. "Bending is easy. But it ain't what keeps a man upright." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe his resolve was enough, but fear sat heavy in her bones. The town had turned colder since Daniel had stood against the auction, against the sheriff's threats, against the whispers that spread like wildfire. Pride might hold him tall, but would it hold him alive? By morning, frost had silvered the ground. They walked together into town, each step a drumbeat of defiance. Clara carried her daughters close, their small hands clutching at her skirts. Daniel's stride was firm, but Clara caught the flicker in his jaw, the strain he hid behind his steady silence. Main Street was lined with townsfolk, all gathered as though for a hanging. Their faces were split between curiosity and quiet hunger, the hunger of people eager to see power proved at someone else's cost. The courthouse loomed ahead, its doors yawning wide. Inside, the air was colder still, though the stove burned red in the corner. Sheriff Grady leaned back in his chair at the front, boots crossed, his smirk the very shape of a man who believed the world would always lean his way. "Well, look who decided to come walking in on his own 2 feet," he drawled. "Saves us the trouble of dragging you." Daniel didn't answer. He guided Clara to a bench and then stood alone in the center of the room. His shadow stretched long under the weak morning light. Clara's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She wanted to reach for him, to anchor him, but she knew his strength was something he had to carry without her hand in plain sight. The accusations spilled like cheap whiskey: theft, harboring vagrants, defying lawful order. Lies each one, but polished so often they gleamed as truth in the sheriff's mouth. Clara clenched her fists until her nails bit deep into her palms. Each false word was not just a stone against Daniel but against her daughters, against every soul who had ever been thrown aside. When the sheriff finally paused, Daniel lifted his head. His voice carried through the still air, not loud but weighted with the kind of calm that could not be bent. "You call me a thief," he said. "But I never took what wasn't offered. I call you thieves. You take hope from the weak, you take pride from the poor, and you reckon that's law. Maybe I'm standing alone here, but I'll stand all the same." The room shifted. Murmurs rose at the edges. Some eyes flickered down, shamed. Others hardened, unwilling to hear truth that cut too close. Clara watched Daniel, her chest aching with both terror and something fiercer, love blooming like a flame that refused to die even in the coldest room. Sheriff Grady slammed his hand against the table. "Enough! This town don't need sermons from a man who don't know his place." His gaze slid toward Clara, sharp as a blade. "You think talking in strays makes you noble? That woman and her brats'll drain you dry. Pride won't fill your belly. Pride won't buy their shoes. You'll learn." Clara stood before she knew she had moved. Her voice cracked, but it carried. "Better pride and hunger than shame and plenty." Every head turned. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she didn't sit down. She thought of her daughters watching, of the women in the crowd who had been silent too long. "He gave us shelter when no one else would. He gave us a name when we were thrown away. That's more law than you'll ever know." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the crack of the stove. Daniel's eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just gratitude but something larger, something that steadied her knees and filled her with quiet fire. Love, rooted not in rescue but in standing side by side, unbroken. The sheriff's face darkened. He leaned forward, lips curling. "You've got a tongue sharp enough to hang yourself with, missy. Maybe I oughta." The courthouse doors banged open. A figure strode in, dust clinging to his coat, hat shadowing his face. Clara recognized him with a jolt, the circuit judge, weeks overdue, called by some but never expected to appear. His presence was like a sudden storm rolling through, undeniable and vast. "What's this I hear about justice being handled without me?" The judge's voice boomed. His eyes scanned the room, catching on Daniel, on Clara, on the sheriff. "This trial's mine to oversee, not yours, Grady." The sheriff stammered, caught off guard. The crowd shifted, whispering. For the first time, Clara saw the smirk falter on Grady's face. The judge set down his satchel and squared his shoulders. "I'll hear both sides. And I'll hear them fair." Hope flared sharp and sudden in Clara's chest, so bright it almost hurt. Daniel's hand brushed against hers as he stepped back beside her, their fingers not quite lacing but close enough to promise. Her daughters stirred, blinking awake, and Clara knew they would remember this day, the day pride became more than defiance, the day love stood taller than fear. Yet even as the balance seemed to tip, Clara felt a chill run through her. The judge's arrival might shift the trial, but Grady's pride was a beast not easily starved. The fight was not over. It was only changing shape. Outside, the wind rattled the courthouse windows. Inside, Clara drew a long breath and met Daniel's eyes. Whatever came, they would face it together. Still, as the judge called the room to order, a question lingered like thunder at the edge of a storm. What price would the West demand before it let them truly belong?